One of Tom Hanks' most memorable movies is Forrest Gump. And when I read this text that we have here, the first thing, when it talks about large groups of people walking along with Jesus, I think about the scene in which Forrest Gump, a very unsophisticated man who has been given guidance by his mother all through his life, loses his mother to cancer and is sitting on the front porch of the house, devastated, in shock, and wondering what to do next, and gets up and begins to do the greatest gift that his mother ever gave him, and that was the ability to walk and then to run. And so he starts to run. And he said, I ran across town, then I ran across the county, then I thought I might as well run across the state. And he winds up running across the continent one direction and back in the other direction, and then keeps right on doing it, because as anybody knows who's taken a hit like that, anything that organizes your life into do this now is helpful. Much better than sitting there saying, who am I, where am I, and what should I do? But in the process of running, just to keep his life organized, people discover him. And this is in the 60s, when we all think out there must be a guru who knows what's going on. And so this unsophisticated man becomes a news item and gets advertised in places and followed by people with microphones and tape recorders saying, are you running for world peace? How about the environment? Women's rights? And even though he doesn't give any answer, because he hasn't even thought about things like that, another young man runs up to him after a while and says, oh man, I can't believe it's actually you. You're here. I thought the first time I saw you, now here's a guy who's got it all together. Here's a man who knows where it's at. I'm going to follow you. And he starts to jog right behind him. And Forrest Gump's commentary is, I had lots of company. Because a whole lot of people begin to follow Forrest Gump running across the country, secure in the belief, which we often project on anybody else that we want to, that they know what we need. Until one point, he stops on a mountain road, and about 60 paces behind him, there's a whole crowd of people who stop and wait for his every word. And he says, I'm tired now. I think I'll go home, and walks clean through them back to his home and sits at the front porch, leaving everyone to wonder what just happened here. Aren't crowds wonderful? I'm thinking about a crowd recently that had someone look at them and say, what have you got to lose? Now there's a question to ask a crowd. There are all kinds of crowds who follow leaders and eventually become large enough to tell the leaders what to do. I notice crowds forming all over the planet these days. A crowd on this side, a crowd on that side. And I'm not so much concerned about the leaders as I am about the crowd. Who are these people? What do they expect? What are they thinking? Where do they think this is going? What exactly do they have to lose or gain? One of the key features of the ministry of Jesus is that a crowd similar to that would follow him. Now, let's distinguish something. There was a group of people called his disciples. There were the three, Peter, James, and John. There were the 12, that's the rest of the disciples. There were the 70, a larger circle of people, and there were 500, all of whom had committed on some level, according to their ability, to follow him. For instance, the disciples go with him everywhere he goes. Now, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are two sisters and a brother who live and conduct their lives in Bethany. They follow him by being there for him when he passes through town, and by making known his way by living it in a community, in a certain place, in a certain time. Two different ways of doing it. They all followed him. But this crowd is a crowd that has shown up at a time when he is headed towards Jerusalem, and all they know is that they've heard about him, that they begin to follow him. Some of them will look for food, some of them will look for teaching, some of them will look to him to say, hooray for our side. And whenever a group like that comes around, Jesus looks at them every once in a while and does something to thin them out, which is not the way you win an election. And in this particular case, he looked at them and said, "You have to be my disciples." On another case, he simply taught in parables. They said, "This is too hard to understand." And a whole lot of people went home. In fact, Jesus' entire life and ministry is a process of causing people to drop out until on the cross, nobody's left. That's bad politics. But it's Jesus' way. And it's something that needs to be understood, penetrated. There are large groups of people who are following along with him. Jesus turned and told them, "Anyone who comes to me but refuses to let go of father, mother, spouse, children, brothers, sisters," quite a list. Yes, even one's own self, can't be my disciple. The language of can't has to be penetrated. What it actually reads is not able to be my disciple. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean I'm not letting you in? That was not Jesus' way. He never told anybody they couldn't come in. He simply qualified them as to whether they wanted to drop out or not. Does it mean you won't be up to this? Because the next question is, up to what? What's coming? What am I signing up for? It's like getting married. Have you noticed that? My wife and I chuckle about this. We just passed our 45th. Clueless. First day of our marriage. Clueless. No idea. Where is she here? She's. And so are you. If you are married, clueless. I don't know what I signed up for. All I know is that every day when I wake up, I marry her in my heart again. Whatever that day is going to hold. Today she's married to a man who can't stand up straight. I don't know. I don't think Jesus meant that. There's a third one. In the end, this will be what's the deciding factor for you. Because one day it isn't going to be about what do I believe and can I join the church and all the rest of that stuff. But the question of authenticity is going to arise in your soul, and you're going to say, am I the real deal or am I a complete fraud when it comes to Jesus Christ? And that question is answered by whether you follow. And following is a journey. It's not an arrival. It's a path, it's a road, it's got stuff on it. You confront the stuff as you go. Every day you make the decision, I have decided to follow Jesus, or I have decided to drop out in the sidelines and watch. I could see some of the crowd at this point saying, is there a McDonald's here anywhere nearby? Because all of a sudden I need to get away from this. Let's talk about the mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, and all the rest of that sort of stuff in there too, because it sounds like Jesus is saying you need to go home and look at your mother and say, I hate you. Get out. Which would be contradictory to other things that Jesus said and the entire teaching of Old and New Testament. Quite unlikely that's what he means. However, let's put it together this way. There is an emphasis not really brought forward in this particular text out of the Message on possessions and family, especially for people who have enough money to get to Jerusalem at this time on a pilgrimage. Family and possessions go together. Family is not simply about who loves me and who I love, who gave me birth. It is also about property. It's about who owns what, who inherits what family name goes on this, who has children. It's the sort of thing you get with Henry VIII, who alters his family to get the heir he wants and sees his wives off to either prison or death. It's that kind of family that captivates property, title, wants to add field to field through marriage and allegiance and alliance. It's the kind of family, by the way, in which your sexuality has very little to do with you and has to do with what you can contribute. How often you get pregnant if you're a woman, and what kind of children you bear, and who you married, and on and on and on. And goes on like that, and even exists to this day in various forms, as I've had students who sat in my office in tears and saying, I want to follow Jesus. He has called me. My parents find it disgraceful. And I am to study in seminary, Jesus says, and they think doctors and lawyers and even dentists and accountants are something, but pastors are nothing. And they sit and weep. Family has a way of getting its fingers around you, and it's not about love. It's about prestige. It's about power. Jesus said, that's a world system. From that day to this, it exists. I came to declare a new world in the kingdom of God, that it's already begun, and it's an either or. It's an either or. There's no compromise. You exchange the old kingdom for the new one, which might mean, by the way, that you go back to your family, a renewed person with a renewed perspective, liberated from all of the ties that bind, to love them as they never had been loved before, for different reasons, with nothing to gain, and often through their scorn. Yes, even one's own self. A student asked me once, in preparation for the ministry, would you pray with me through a certain process of inner cleansing? Because I want to deal with certain issues before I enter the pastorate. I said I will. Let's pray. One of the issues that arose was the issue of his father. He was adopted. His father was an absolutely superb gentleman who loved him deeply, but who died very early in his life. So that as a young boy, he grew up with a memory of an absolutely stellar man, but not that man's presence. And so he did, with that memory, what most of us do. He elaborated it, until that father became very like a god to him. The net effect of that was for him to say, this is my father. This is me. He is great. I could never be. And the fact of the matter is, his father was not in the way. But the imagined image, dare I say idol, that he had made out of his memory of his father was in his way. And prayer for that man was losing that aspect of himself, losing that aspect of his family, acknowledging that his father was a man, a good man, but that's all he was. And that he himself, released from the bondage of needing to exalt that memory in perpetuity by being small himself, could actually become a good man too. How I remember his tears as he let that part of himself die and let something new come in its place. Isn't it amazing what family can be? All of the stuff that attaches to it, that attaches to our souls, to ourselves. I'm divorced, I'm single, I'm abused, go down through the list, and all of those things hamstring me, and Jesus says, let it go. Let it go. Because you can't be my disciple if you're dragging that baggage. Let it go. Let it go. Anyone who won't shoulder his own cross and follow behind me can't be my disciple. Anytime you read anything in the Gospels, you've got two perspectives. One is the perspective being described. Here is Jesus talking to people. But over here, you have people listening to somebody tell that story. In Luke's case, there's probably 90 years difference. For these people to hear about a cross is for them to think, excuse me, Jesus has not died on the cross in the story yet. It's not his yet, but it sure is other people's. It's disgraceful. It is an extraordinary rejection. Why do we have to use that image? But here, 90 years later, as Luke's gospel is read to people, oh, Christ's cross is all too real. Not only in his own personal life, where he dies on the cross, but in the lived life of the church as it realizes following Jesus is going to cost us. We are going to die to friends. We are going to die to the synagogue. We're going to die to favor within the Grecian community. There are all kinds of aspects of life that are slip-sliding away, as Simon and Garfunkel said, and they're not coming back. The cross for us is losing. And the question comes again and again to us as a Christian community, do you really want to follow Jesus? In the city of Mosul, where the Church of My Ordination is returning to help rebuild a church destroyed, ask Christians about the cost. They've lost their homes, they've lost their cars, they've lost their jobs, their churches have been blown apart. They've watched entire populations either leave or be slaughtered. And the question comes up every single day, have you decided to follow Jesus? No turning back, no turning back. Is there anyone here who planning to build a new house doesn't first sit down and figure the cost so you know if you can complete it? I think about some of the foundations that I watched in 2008. There's still some around here too. Giant foundations that they simply plywooded up and said, we're going to wait a while on this because the money disappeared. If you only get the foundation laid and then run out of money, you're going to look pretty foolish. Everyone passing by will poke fun at you. He started something he couldn't finish. Or can you imagine a king going into battle against another king without first deciding whether it is possible with his 10,000 troops to face the 20,000 troops of the other? If he decides he can't, won't he send an emissary and work out a truce? And the answer to both of these seems to be, well, yeah, he would sort of do that sort of thing on a very grand scale, work out a budget. Only makes sense. Calculate the opposition versus the cost of engagement of the enemy. Can we actually win this thing? It'd be stupid not to do that sort of thing. And the impression seems to be left with this, well, then sit down and calculate whether you can follow Jesus. The problem is, you don't know what the budget is. Do you? You don't know what the adversary is going to throw at you, do you? That's the problem. Rather, I think what Jesus is saying here is, if you are coming to the cross and you're coming to my cross, do you remember what they said? This would be for Luke's audience. Do you remember what they said to me when I hung on the cross? Saved others. Can't save himself. Loser. And this passage is actually Jesus saying to the one who wants to pick up the cross, if you are figuring that following Jesus will one day pay off, and that they will acknowledge you were right all along, and that you had it figured, you're following the wrong Savior. For in this life we bear witness to a world that is to come, but many of us will pass from this life without realizing it, and everybody will say, and what was that about? Reminds me of my early days when, as a kid, pretty much, I was a young man, but still a kid in my head, I said, I'm going to be in the ministry. And I well remember an older man looking at me and saying, well, you still decided to be in the ministry or you're going to give it up? And I had to smile. How would I know? How would I know? Clueless again. Maybe that's the title of this sermon, Clueless and Following. because you don't know. Jesus asks you to follow him, and you must be in a relationship with him to follow. And apart from relationship with him, I suspect you're not able to be his disciple, and neither am I. Reminds me of the recovery service, actually. You know, when they go through the 12 steps, I come to the recovery service so I can hear the 12 steps, and I can sit there and say to myself, well, I give up. I'm not even an addict, and I still give up. Have you ever heard them? You go through those 12 steps? My land. You're kidding me. I just say, make a start. Yes, make a start. I can't finish. I can't do that. I love the part, 2 parts, where it talks about a higher power who shows up as you go on the journey, right? And this journey doesn't stop, right? Neither does the higher power stop. And I also like the part where it says, if this sounds impossible, let us tell you, we found that there were places where it was impossible except for that higher power, but if you kept at it, so did the higher power keep at it, and it can be done. Okay, but I don't hear anybody in that recovery saying, now I'm done, let's forget it. Very good paradigm. Jesus doesn't want to know if you believe. He doesn't want to know if you want to attend or join. He wants to know if you want to follow, and that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like. Simply put, if you're not willing to take what is dearest to you, whether plans or people, and kiss it goodbye, you can't be my disciple. There's a special emphasis in that particular sentence, not showing up here, on possessions. I just like to close with that sort of emphasis, possessions, because often it comes down to this. The link of family and possessions was there. I think, and I'll just give a couple of examples from across history. Let me start with the great Pope in the 6th century, Gregory the Great. Gregory lives in Rome. His parents have a big house right down from the Roman Colosseum. It's seen better days, but nonetheless, his family's prominent. His father and himself will be like the mayor of the city. But they're also deeply spiritual. He has an aunt and a mother, and they're both Catholic saints today. So he has a deeply Christian upbringing, and he's got a lot of money. When the pressure comes on from barbarians in Rome, they take off to their villa and escape all the noise. He is so well versed in Roman law that they make him an emissary, so like an ambassador and a diplomat, to Constantinople, which is now the seat of the empire. And he goes there like a lawyer to plead the case for Rome, which is under siege constantly. Please come and give us some relief. That doesn't go very far, but it does establish his reputation in civil service. This guy's good. He's spiritual and he's rich. Works for me. But when he comes back to Rome, he realizes the emptiness of his soul. So he goes to his villas, which are now his, as he's inherited them, houses, land, mother, father, brother, sister, hear it all. And he causes them to become a monastery, forsakes the ownership of the property, and becomes himself a monk. Counting the spiritual life a deeper possession, shades of the song we just sang, Kathy, a deeper possession than all the property he could ever have inherited from all of his family. And is quite content to do so until the church, realizing that it is in need of a leader, a new bishop of Rome, a new pope, says, who's better than Gregory? And when Gregory gets word of it, he hits the carriage, hitches up the horses, and heads out of town. It's the last thing he wants to do, is to re-enter the entire world of domestic, international, and ecclesial politics, and there try to be spiritual. But you know what they do? They capture him. They chase him. They stop him. They pull him out of his wagon and they lay hands on him. And unlike us in the voluntary age, which we would basically say, well, I'm still not doing it. Gregory realizes that once the church lays hands on you, your options are now over. And he becomes one of the greatest reforming popes the church has ever seen. Reformed worship. One of the greatest missionary popes who brought the gospel to Britain. One of the greatest liturgical popes. Ever heard of Gregorian chant? The stuff you hear in Taizé. You should listen to it sometimes. Gregory the Great. A man who followed even where he didn't want to go. Eschewing everything and pursuing. That's example one. That's on a big scene. Let's take a second one. There's a young man who was a friend of mine, continues to be a friend of mine, who graduated when Ambrose was in Regina, Saskatchewan, and though he had considerable skills and abilities, determined that he would plant himself in what is called, and I hesitate to use this term, I hope you'll understand it, Moccasin Flats in Regina, which is the inner city. It is called that by the Aboriginal population. They also call it the Hood. It's, let's say, give it 10, 15 years ago, you could have bought a house in there for $20,000. Not a bad one either. In fact, I know another student who bought one and used it to minister to the children in the area and thought, it's only $20,000, I'll buy the house next door. And renovated it and used that to minister to the people in the inner city when his family, like the family of the man I'm going to mention, could easily have relocated to any suburb around and still can. They choose to be where they are. They choose to raise their children in that kind of environment, and he chooses, whereas he could command any kind of salary you want, he chooses to live on faith and on second-hand equipment in many cases, so that he can position himself to serve a group of people in that area who need an alternative to prison. Because most of them head in that direction. And it's part of Canada's intractable problem of sending its Aboriginal people to jail. It's its main social response. He stays there and teaches them how to repair bicycles and challenges them with achievement, how to do woodworking, and challenges them with engagement. He takes them on bike hikes they have to qualify for and says to them basically in very simple ways that they can grasp, also plants a church among them, you have a choice. There is another way. But the only way he can present that to them is if he lives that with his wife and 2 children. Forsaking father, mother, brother, sister, etc. equals options I might have taken. My time's up. I think probably you've already got the message, haven't you? I would just like to acknowledge something personally. One of the things I was clueless about is that diligence plus saving equals assets. You understand what I'm talking about, don't you? There's accountants here. You surely must understand that. Okay, I personally am discovering myself in a situation where I have more assets than I need. Now, I learned and heard the call of the gospel. My parents' only claim in my life is that I follow Jesus. That is the only claim I ever put in my children's lives, and you can't require that. You can only pray for it. But if they go to the other side of the planet in serving Jesus, I'm well satisfied. That's it. But it's not it for me. But I suspect it isn't it for you. And it isn't it for us. We are in possession of an asset. This church is in possession of an asset, and all of us collectively are, that belongs to the kingdom of Jesus Christ. Or we're not disciples. So the question is, how are those things deployed so that his kingdom, his righteousness, and his gospel is made known to others yet again. There it is.